At 72 years old, Penny Ellis believed the cruelest words she would ever hear came from her dying husband. "There's nothing left to leave you," Arthur whispered before his final breath. But 3 days after the funeral, his son Grant stood in their Pittsburgh apartment and told Penny she had no home, no savings, and no place in the Ellis family. That night, while folding Arthur's old church coat with trembling hands, Penny felt something hidden beneath the lining. A sealed envelope. Inside was a key. A faded photograph of a forgotten farmhouse in West Virginia, and one sentence in Arthur's handwriting: "Forgive me for the lie. I left you the only thing they could never steal. If you believe truth can still rise from betrayal, stay with Penny's story until the very end." The apartment felt painfully quiet after Arthur Ellis died. For 18 years, Penny Ellis had shared the small Pittsburgh apartment with a man who never spoke loudly, never wasted money, and never forgot to kiss her forehead before bed. The rooms were old and narrow, but to Penny they had always felt safe. The faded wallpaper, the chipped kitchen counter, even the rattling pipes in winter carried memories of a life she believed had been honest. Now, every corner felt hollow. 3 days had passed since the funeral. The lilies from the church sat wilting beside the window. Sympathy cards covered the dining table. Arthur's reading glasses still rested beside his favorite armchair, as though he might return at any moment and ask where she had hidden the television remote again. Penny stood alone in the bedroom, folding Arthur's clothes with trembling hands. His gray sweaters, his work shirts, his old church coat. She pressed the coat briefly against her chest and closed her eyes. It still carried the scent of cedar soap and winter air. Tears burned behind her eyelids, but she forced herself to stay composed. At 72 years old, Penny had already survived enough humiliation in life to know grief became even crueler when witnessed by cold people. A hard knock echoed through the apartment. Penny looked toward the door. She already knew who it was. Grant Ellis never knocked softly. Before she could fully reach the hallway, the lock turned and Grant stepped inside with the confidence of a man entering property he already owned. Behind him came his wife Caroline. Grant removed his gloves slowly while scanning the apartment. He wore an expensive dark coat and carried a thick beige folder beneath one arm. Caroline followed quietly, her polished boots clicking against the wooden floor. Her expression held rehearsed sympathy, but her eyes were already studying the furniture. Penny suddenly felt like a stranger in her own home. "Penny," Grant said, "we need to discuss a few things." His voice sounded formal, almost impatient. Penny tightened her grip on Arthur's folded sweater. "Couldn't this wait another day?" Grant shook his head. "No, it's important." Caroline closed the door behind them, carefully sealing the silence inside the apartment. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, distant traffic moved through wet Pittsburgh streets, while rain tapped softly against the windows. Penny wished desperately that Arthur were sitting in his chair beside the lamp reading quietly the way he always had in the evenings. Instead, only his son remained, and something about Grant's face unsettled her. There was no grief in it, only urgency. Grant placed the folder on the dining table and opened it neatly. "You know Dad handled most of the finances himself," he began. Penny nodded cautiously. "Well, after reviewing everything, there are legal matters that need immediate attention." The words sounded rehearsed. Penny slowly lowered herself into a chair. "What kind of matters?" Grant slid several papers across the table. The apartment lease was always under Dad's name. The bank accounts were structured through his estate planning. His remaining assets transferred directly to family beneficiaries. Penny stared at him blankly. "I was his family," she said quietly. Grant sighed as though this conversation exhausted him already. "Penny, nobody is trying to hurt you, but you have to understand reality here." Reality. The word stung. Caroline moved toward the bookshelf and began examining framed photographs. She picked up a picture from Penny and Arthur's anniversary dinner, glanced at it briefly, then placed it back crookedly. Penny felt heat rise in her chest. Grant continued speaking. Dad told me before he died that there really wasn't much left after medical expenses. Penny's heartbeat quickened. Arthur's final words suddenly echoed in her memory. There's nothing left to leave you. At the time, she'd assumed he meant money no longer mattered. She had held his fragile hand in the hospital and told him she only cared about him surviving. Now, those words sounded different, colder, more deliberate. Grant tapped the documents. The remaining funds are basically depleted. There's no provision here for long-term support. Penny frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does if you understand the expenses Dad had. We paid bills together. Yes, Grant replied sharply, but legally most of those accounts belong to him. Penny stared at the papers without fully seeing them. Numbers blurred together. Legal language swam before her tired eyes. Something felt wrong. Arthur had never been wealthy, but he had always been careful. He tracked every grocery receipt. He repaired old shoes instead of buying new ones. He constantly reassured Penny they were stable. So, where had everything gone? Caroline opened a cabinet drawer. Penny looked up immediately. "What are you doing, trying to organize things?" Caroline answered lightly. "It'll help later." Help what Grant finally looked directly at Penny. "You'll need to move out." The room went silent. Even the rain outside seemed to stop. Penny blinked slowly. "Move out." Grant folded his hands together. "The building manager agreed to give you a few days." "A few days," she whispered. 3. Penny felt as if the floor beneath her chair had disappeared. "This is my home." Grant's expression hardened slightly. "Legally, it's not." Caroline finally sat down across from Penny, speaking in the careful tone people used with frightened children. "At your age, Penny, maybe a smaller place would actually be better. Less stress, less responsibility." Penny looked at her in disbelief. 18 years. 18 years of cooking Arthur's meals, washing his clothes, helping him through surgeries, sitting beside him during sleepless nights after his heart condition worsened. And now she was being spoken to like an inconvenience. Grant leaned back in his chair. "There are senior housing programs, maybe church assistance. You won't be abandoned." The humiliation hit harder than grief. Penny suddenly remembered being 30 years old, standing behind a noisy school cafeteria counter while hundreds of children laughed and shouted around her. Back then, she had managed budgets, employees' schedules, and problems without fear. People respected her then. Now, as an elderly widow, everyone looked at her as though she were fragile furniture waiting to be removed. "I was Arthur's wife," she said softly. Grant rubbed his forehead impatiently. "You were his companion later in life." The sentence sliced through her. Not wife, companion. Something inside Penny cracked quietly. Caroline stood again and began examining dishes inside the kitchen cabinet. "This china probably belonged to Arthur's first marriage," she murmured. Penny slowly rose from her chair. "Please, stop touching my things." Caroline looked offended. "We're trying to help." "No," Penny said quietly. "You're trying to erase me." Grant stood immediately. "Let's not make this emotional." "How can it not be emotional?" Penny asked, her voice finally trembling. "Your father was buried 3 days ago." Grant avoided her eyes. That small movement frightened Penny more than anger would have. It was the look of a man already hiding something. "I need time," she whispered. "You have 3 days," Grant replied. Then he gathered the papers and closed the folder. Caroline picked up her handbag. At the doorway, Grant paused one final time. Dad understood reality before the end, Penny. I think part of him knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. Arrangement. Not marriage. Not love. Penny felt suddenly cold all over. After they left, silence flooded the apartment again. She remained standing in the middle of the living room for several minutes, staring at the closed door. Then her knees weakened. She sat slowly in Arthur's chair and finally allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the exhausted, broken crying of a woman who realized she had not only lost her husband, she was losing the life built around him. Hours passed. Darkness settled over Pittsburgh. Eventually, Penny forced herself to stand and begin packing. If Grant returned, she would not let Caroline touch Arthur's belongings again. She folded clothes carefully into an old suitcase. Sweaters, shoes, photographs. Her recipe notebook from her years managing the school cafeteria. Near midnight, she reached for Arthur's old church coat hanging near the closet. The heavy fabric slipped across her hands. Then she paused. Something inside the lining felt strange. Hard. Hidden. Penny frowned and touched the inner seam again. There was definitely something sewn beneath the fabric. Her pulse quickened. She carried the coat carefully to the kitchen table beneath the lamp. With shaking fingers, she found a tiny stitched opening near the inside seam. Arthur had hidden something there deliberately. Penny grabbed sewing scissors from the drawer and carefully loosened the thread. A small object slid into her palm. An envelope. Old. Cream-colored. Her name written across the front in Arthur's handwriting. Penny stopped breathing for a moment. Slowly, she opened it. Inside was a small brass key attached to a faded paper tag. A photograph of an old farmhouse surrounded by woods and mountains, and a handwritten note. Only one sentence. "Forgive me for the lie. I left you the only thing they could never steal." Tears filled Penny's eyes again. She turned the brass key over in her trembling hand. Attached to it were 3 words written in faded ink. Red Hollow Road. For the first time since Arthur died, Penny felt something stronger than grief begin rising inside her. A question. And somewhere beneath that question, hope. Penny Ellis did not sleep that night. She remained at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the brass key resting beside Arthur's letter. The apartment around her had fallen silent except for the old refrigerator humming softly in the corner. Outside the window, rain slid down the glass in silver lines while distant traffic moved through Pittsburgh like a world continuing without her. Again and again, Penny reread the sentence written in Arthur's uneven handwriting. "Forgive me for the lie. I left you the only thing they could never steal." The lie. Arthur had admitted it himself. For 18 years, Penny believed her husband was a cautious, quiet man who avoided conflict simply because he hated drama. Now, she wondered how much fear had hidden behind his silence during the last years of his life. She touched the edge of the faded farmhouse photograph carefully. Arthur stood in front of the old house, decades younger, wearing jeans and a work jacket. Beside him stood a dark-haired woman Penny had never seen before. The woman's hand rested lightly on Arthur's shoulder, and both of them looked serious instead of happy. On the back of the photograph, faded ink formed 4 words. Clara's place. The truth starts here. Penny's chest tightened. Who was Clara? Why had Arthur hidden this from her? And why did Grant seem so desperate to remove her from the apartment before she could discover it? By morning, Penny's eyes burned from exhaustion. She brewed coffee but forgot to drink it. Her mind kept returning to moments she had ignored over the past 2 years. Arthur lowering his voice whenever Grant called. Arthur locking desk drawers he once left open. Arthur staring nervously through the apartment blinds after visits from his son. At the time, Penny assumed illness had made him anxious. His heart condition had worsened quickly during the final year. Some nights he woke sweating from nightmares and refused to explain them. Now those memories felt different. Not confusion, fear. A knock came at the door again around 9 o'clock. Penny stiffened immediately, but this time it was only Mrs. Donnelly from across the hall carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "Oh, sweetheart," the elderly woman whispered the moment Penny opened the door. "You look exhausted." Penny forced a weak smile. Mrs. Donnelly stepped inside carefully and glanced toward the dining table covered with papers and half-packed boxes. "You shouldn't be alone right now." Penny almost told her everything then, about Grant, about the envelope, about Arthur's hidden key, but something stopped her. Instinct. Arthur had hidden the envelope for a reason. So, instead, Penny simply thanked her neighbor, accepted the casserole, and promised she was managing fine. The lie tasted bitter. After Mrs. Donnelly left, Penny looked toward Arthur's old writing desk near the living room window. Suddenly, she remembered something. 3 months before Arthur died, she had walked into the room unexpectedly and found him stuffing papers into the bottom drawer. His face had gone pale when he saw her. Just organizing old records, he had said too quickly. At the time, she thought little of it. Now, her pulse quickened. Penny crossed the room and knelt carefully beside the desk. The bottom drawer was locked. Arthur never locked anything before the last year. She searched the kitchen junk drawer until she found a small sewing needle thin enough to force the cheap lock. After several shaky attempts, the drawer finally clicked open. Inside lay old receipts, utility bills, church bulletins, and medication paperwork. Nothing unusual. Penny's shoulders slumped in disappointment. Then she noticed an envelope hidden beneath a stack of hospital forms. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper covered in Arthur's handwriting. Penny unfolded it slowly. "If you found the key, it means Grant moved faster than I feared." Her breath caught. The letter continued. "I never wanted to bring this darkness into your life, Penny, but I ran out of time. Grant has watched my finances for years. He believes Red Hollow belongs to him. If he learns what is buried there before you arrive, he will destroy every piece of truth left behind." Penny lowered the paper slowly. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. Arthur continued, "Do not trust Grant. Do not trust Caroline. And do not trust anyone connected to Ellis Development Group." Penny stared at the sentence in disbelief. Grant's company. Arthur had spoken proudly about it for years. He always described Grant as successful, ambitious, driven. But beneath those compliments, Penny now remembered something else. Guilt. Arthur always looked guilty when discussing his son. She kept reading. "I told you there was nothing left because I believed it would protect you. If Grant thought you knew about Red Hollow, he would never stop coming after you." Tears blurred the words. Penny pressed one trembling hand against her mouth. Why hadn't Arthur trusted her enough to tell the truth earlier? Why had he carried this burden alone until death? Anger mixed painfully with grief inside her chest. For the first time since the funeral, Penny felt hurt by Arthur himself. Not because he lacked money, because he had hidden fear secrets and another woman's name from her for years. Clara. The thought stung more than she expected. Penny folded the letter carefully and looked toward the apartment window. Morning light spilled weakly across the room, illuminating dust drifting through the air. Everything suddenly felt unstable. Their marriage, their finances, even Arthur's memories. She needed answers. By noon, Penny boarded a bus downtown to the bank. The cold wind cut through her coat as she crossed the crowded sidewalk. Pittsburgh moved around her in loud, hurried waves. Business people rushing through intersections, buses groaning beside wet curbs, construction noise echoing between buildings. Nobody noticed the elderly widow walking slowly with a hidden key inside her purse. At the bank, the young receptionist offered a polite smile before directing Penny toward a private office. The branch manager, Mr. Keller, greeted her nervously. "Mrs. Ellis," he said carefully, I'm very sorry for your loss. Penny sat stiffly across from his desk. I need to understand what happened to our accounts. Mr. Keller adjusted his glasses uneasily. There were authorized transfers over several months. Authorized by who he hesitated. Your husband's power of attorney representative. Penny's stomach tightened instantly. Mr. Keller avoided direct eye contact. The paperwork legally permitted account management. Penny felt suddenly cold. How much was taken? Mr. Keller slid a printed statement toward her. The numbers made her dizzy. Large withdrawals, account closures, transfers into business investment accounts connected to Ellis Development Group. Penny looked up slowly. Arthur would never give away everything. Mr. Keller lowered his voice. Mrs. Ellis, your husband seemed distressed during his final visits here. The sentence lingered heavily between them. Distressed. Not confused. Distressed. Penny's heartbeat quickened. Did he say why? Mr. Keller hesitated again. He mentioned pressure from family. That's all I can responsibly say. Family. Grant. Penny suddenly remembered another moment she once ignored. 6 months earlier, Grant and Arthur argued quietly in the hallway outside the apartment. Penny only heard fragments. You owe this family. You don't understand what you're risking. We're running out of time. Arthur looked shaken for hours afterward. At the time, he insisted it was only business stress. Now, Penny understood those arguments were never about ordinary money. They were about Red Hollow. By the time Penny returned to the apartment that evening, fear had transformed into certainty. Grant knew about the farmhouse. Grant wanted something hidden there, and Arthur died, terrified his son would reach it first. Penny locked the apartment door carefully behind her. Then she froze. One of the kitchen drawers stood slightly open. She was certain she had closed it before leaving. Slowly, Penny crossed the room. The drawer contained old utensils and towels. Nothing appeared missing. But when she looked toward the bedroom closet, her stomach dropped. Arthur's church coat was no longer hanging where she left it. Panic surged through her chest. She rushed into the bedroom and found the coat tossed carelessly across the bed. Someone had searched it. The lining where Penny cut open the hidden seam had been turned completely inside out. Grant had been there. Or someone working for him. Penny grabbed the envelope from beneath her sweater drawer and clutched it tightly against her chest. For the first time since Arthur died, she truly understood the danger surrounding whatever he had hidden. And suddenly, Pittsburgh no longer felt safe. Penny looked at the brass key again. Red Hollow Road. Arthur's final secret waited there. And if she stayed in the apartment much longer, Grant might take it before she ever learned the truth. By midnight, Penny had made her decision. She would leave Pittsburgh before Grant returned. Even if she had nowhere else left in the world to go, Penny Ellis left Pittsburgh before sunrise. The city still slept beneath cold gray clouds as she stood at the bus station, clutching her suitcase with one hand and Arthur's church coat with the other. The brass key rested deep inside her purse beside the hidden letters and faded photograph. Everything she still owned fit into one worn suitcase. At 72 years old, Penny never imagined she would become the kind of woman who disappeared quietly before dawn, but fear had changed everything. Each time the station doors opened, Penny glanced over her shoulder expecting to see Grant walking toward her with that same hard expression and legal folder beneath his arm. Even now, she could not fully understand how Arthur's son had transformed into someone so cold. Or perhaps, she thought painfully, he had always been that way. The bus finally arrived with a loud hiss of brakes. Penny climbed aboard slowly and chose a seat near the middle. Around her sat exhausted workers, college students and travelers staring blankly through rain-streaked windows. Nobody noticed the elderly widow carrying secrets hidden inside an old coat. As the bus pulled away from Pittsburgh, Penny watched the city fade behind her. Steel bridges, brick buildings, smoke drifting above factory rooftops. For 18 years, she had believed she would grow old there beside Arthur. They were not wealthy people, but they had routines. Saturday grocery trips, Sunday church services, evening walks during summer when Arthur's heart was still strong enough for hills. Now, every memory felt uncertain. Had Arthur loved her honestly, or had their marriage been built on secrets from the very beginning? Penny closed her eyes briefly. No. Despite everything, she still believed Arthur loved her. Fear and love could exist together. She understood that now. Hours passed as the bus traveled deeper into West Virginia. Gradually, the crowded highways disappeared, replaced by narrow roads winding through forests and mountains. Small towns drifted past, the windows, faded gas stations, rusted barns, churches with peeling paint. The farther they traveled from Pittsburgh, the quieter the world became. By late afternoon, the bus stopped beside a weathered station sign that read Red Hollow. Penny stepped off slowly. Cold mountain wind swept through the nearly empty street. The town looked forgotten by time. Old storefronts lined the road beneath cracked signs and rusted awnings. Pickup trucks sat parked beside muddy sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked endlessly. Penny tightened Arthur's coat around herself. For a moment, uncertainty overwhelmed her. What if she had made a terrible mistake? What if Arthur's secret led nowhere? What if Grant was right, and grief had made her foolish? The bus pulled away behind her, leaving only silence. Now, there was no turning back. Penny looked down at the faded photograph again. The farmhouse stood somewhere near Red Hollow Road, but she had no idea where that actually was. A diner across the street glowed warmly beneath a flickering sign that read Harper's Diner. Penny hesitated before crossing the road carefully. The smell of coffee and fried onions wrapped around her the moment she stepped inside. Several locals glanced up briefly before returning to their meals. Penny immediately felt visible in the uncomfortable way outsiders often feel in small towns. An older woman behind the counter approached with cautious kindness. "You traveling through?" she asked. Her silver hair was tied back loosely, and deep lines framed her tired but warm eyes. Penny nodded uncertainly. "I'm looking for Red Hollow Road." The woman paused. Something flickered across her face at the mention of the name. "You got family out there?" Penny hesitated before answering. "My husband did." The woman studied her for a long moment. "I'm Maggie Harper," she finally said. "Coffee's free if you look that tired." Despite everything, Penny almost smiled. "Thank you." Maggie poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug while Penny sat near the counter. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the empty street. "You're not from around here," Maggie said gently. "Pittsburgh." Maggie nodded slowly. "Long way from home." The words struck harder than Penny expected. Home. Did she still have one? Penny carefully removed the farmhouse photograph from her purse and slid it across the counter. "Do you know this place?" Maggie's expression changed immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she picked up the photograph. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. Penny leaned forward. "You recognize it." "That's the old Bell property. Bell, Clara Bell's farm." Penny's pulse quickened instantly. Arthur had written Clara's place on the back of the photograph. "You knew her." Maggie shook her head slowly. "I was young when she disappeared. Most people around here still remember the rumors, though." "Rumors?" Maggie lowered her voice. "Land disputes. Trouble with businessmen." Folks said Clara knew things powerful people wanted buried. Penny felt cold all over. Arthur's letters suddenly seemed even more dangerous. What happened to her nobody knows. Maggie returned to the photograph carefully. One day she was here. Next day she wasn't. Penny stared down at Arthur's younger face beside Clara Bell. How deeply had Arthur been involved with this woman? And why hide it for decades? Maggie studied Penny quietly. "You got somebody meeting you out there?" "No." The older woman frowned. "That farm's abandoned. I still need to see it." For a moment, Maggie looked like she might argue. Instead, she sighed softly and reached beneath the counter for a notepad. "Road's rough this time of year. Follow Route 9 about 6 miles, then turn near the old water tower." Penny accepted the directions carefully. "You think someone still lives there?" she asked. Maggie shook her head immediately. "Not officially." The answer unsettled Penny more than she expected. Night had almost fallen by the time a local taxi dropped Penny near the end of Red Hollow Road. The driver refused to continue farther. "Road floods easy," he muttered. "You'll have to walk the rest." Then he drove away before Penny could respond. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ahead stretched a narrow dirt road disappearing into woods darkened by evening fog. Bare trees leaned over broken fences while wind moved through branches with low whispering sounds. Penny gripped her suitcase and began walking. Mud clung to her shoes. Her breathing grew heavier with every step. Several times she nearly turned back, but Arthur's letters kept pushing her forward. Finally, through the trees she saw it. The farmhouse. Old, weathered, half swallowed by vines and darkness. One side of the porch sagged dangerously. Several windows were broken. The roof looked uneven beneath years of storm damage. Tall weeds surrounded the property like the earth itself was trying to reclaim it. Penny stopped at the gate. Fear settled heavily into her stomach. This couldn't possibly be what Arthur meant to leave her. The place looked abandoned for decades. Still trembling, Penny approached the front steps slowly. The wood creaked beneath her weight. Wind rattled loose shutters somewhere above. At the front door, she removed the brass key from her purse. For several seconds, she simply stared at it, resting in her palm. Arthur had hidden this key inside his church coat for years. Whatever waited here mattered enough for him to die protecting it. Penny inserted the key carefully into the rusted lock. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly, click. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. Penny pushed the door open. Dust filled the air immediately. Moonlight spilled faintly through broken windows onto ruined furniture and warped wooden floors. The house smelled of mildew, age, and something else beneath it all, a disturbance. Someone had been inside before. Penny saw overturned drawers, cabinets left hanging open, old papers scattered across the floor. This was not simple abandonment. Someone had searched this house. Recently. Her heartbeat quickened. She moved carefully through the dark living room until she noticed something strange near the back hallway. A pantry door. Unlike everything else in the house, this door remained locked. Fresh scratches surrounded the handle. Deep scratches, as if someone had tried forcing it open with tools. Penny stared at the damaged wood in silence. Then she slowly realized something terrifying. Grant was not merely searching for money. He was hunting for something hidden inside this house, and he may have already been here before her. Penny Ellis barely slept during her first night at the farmhouse. Wind moved through cracks in the walls with long hollow whistles that sounded almost human in the darkness. Every creak of old wood made her flinch awake. Once, sometime after midnight, she heard something scrape across the porch outside and sat frozen beneath Arthur's coat for nearly 10 minutes, too frightened to move. At 72 years old, Penny had never spent a night completely alone in a place like this. By dawn, exhaustion covered her like a heavy blanket. Cold gray light slowly filled the farmhouse through broken windows. Dust drifted through the air while distant crows cried somewhere beyond the trees. Penny sat up stiffly from the old couch where she had slept poorly. Her back ached, her hands were cold. For several long moments she simply stared around the ruined room, wondering what she was doing there. The farmhouse looked even worse in daylight. Water stains spread across the ceiling. Pieces of wallpaper peeled from the walls. One corner of the floor sagged badly enough that Penny avoided stepping near it. Empty shelves stood crooked beside the fireplace, and the smell of mildew clung to everything. This was Arthur's secret, this broken place. A wave of disappointment hit her suddenly. Maybe Grant had been right. Maybe grief had turned her foolish. Penny lowered her face into her hands. Tears burned behind her eyes again, but this time they came mixed with anger. At Arthur, at Grant, at herself. "I'm too old for this," she whispered into the empty room. For one terrible moment, Penny considered leaving immediately. She still had enough money for a bus ticket back to Pittsburgh. Perhaps the church would help her find temporary housing. Perhaps she could disappear quietly into some small apartment and spend the rest of her life pretending none of this had happened. It would be easier. Safer. But then her eyes drifted toward Arthur's coat folded carefully beside her suitcase, and she remembered his final words. "Forgive me for the lie." Arthur had hidden something here because he believed it mattered enough to protect even after death. Penny slowly stood. Outside, cold mountain air swept across the porch as she opened the front door. Morning fog still covered parts of the property. Tall weeds surrounded the farmhouse, and an old fence leaned sideways near the road. Everything looked abandoned, forgotten, much like Penny herself. Strangely, that thought gave her strength. She spent the next hour cleaning one small corner of the living room. It was not much. Penny found an old broom in the kitchen and pushed years of dust toward the doorway. She wiped dirt from one table and opened windows to let fresh air inside. The work exhausted her quickly, but with every small task the farmhouse felt slightly less hostile. It reminded her of years working in the school cafeteria. Back then, no matter how chaotic things became, Penny always believed order could return one tray, one counter, one floor at a time. Maybe lives worked the same way. Near noon, while wiping dust from the windowsill beside the staircase, Penny noticed something carved faintly into the wood. A.E. Arthur Ellis. Her breath caught. She touched the letters carefully with trembling fingers. Arthur had truly lived here once. Suddenly, the farmhouse no longer felt like a stranger's secret. It felt connected to the man she loved. Penny continued searching the house more carefully after that. Inside a kitchen cabinet, she found an old coffee mug stained brown with age. On the bottom, faded blue paint formed the initials A.E. Arthur's. In the upstairs bedroom closet, she found rusted coat hooks and an old quilt folded beneath newspapers from the 1980s. Signs of life remained everywhere. But so did signs of searching. Drawers emptied, floorboards disturbed, cabinets broken open. Someone had hunted through this farmhouse aggressively. Grant. Penny felt certain now. Late that afternoon, while examining loose bricks near the fireplace, she noticed one brick sitting slightly farther inward than the others. At first, she almost ignored it. Then she remembered Arthur's habit of hiding spare money behind loose panels and old tins during difficult financial years. He always distrusted banks more than most people. Carefully, Penny pressed against the brick. It shifted immediately. Her heartbeat quickened. She pulled it free slowly. Behind it rested another envelope, smaller than the first one. Penny sat down immediately before opening it, suddenly afraid of what Arthur might reveal next. Inside, she found several folded papers and another handwritten letter. Her eyes moved quickly across the first document. A property deed. Penny frowned in confusion until she saw the owner's name, Penelope Ellis, her full legal name. She stared at the paper in shock. The farmhouse. the surrounding land, all legally transferred to her months before Arthur died. Penny's hands began trembling violently. Arthur had left her this place, not by accident, not emotionally, legally. Tears blurred her vision as she unfolded the letter beneath the deed. Penny, if you are reading this, then Grant failed to reach the truth before you did. Red Hollow Farm belongs to you now. I transferred everything quietly before my health collapsed completely. Grant tried for years to pressure me into selling this land through Ellis Development Group. He must never control it. Penny stopped reading. Her mind struggled to understand. Grant's company wanted this property, why the farmhouse looked worthless. But Arthur's letter continued. The state survey changed everything. They discovered valuable mineral deposits near the western ridge and approved preliminary highway expansion discussions last year. The land will become extremely valuable once development begins. Penny looked slowly around the ruined farmhouse again. This place was not worthless at all. Grant had lied from the beginning, not only about the apartment, about everything. Arthur continued. Grant believes only money matters. He does not understand what happened here years ago, but if he finds Clara Bell's testimony before you do, innocent people will lose everything again. Penny's pulse quickened. Clara Bell. Again, her name appeared beside fear and secrecy. The final page included one more warning. The truth was hidden somewhere on this property long before I met you. I was too cowardly to stop what happened back then, but I could not let Grant continue it. Forgive me for waiting too long. Arthur Penny lowered the letter slowly into her lap. Outside, wind moved softly through dead grass while afternoon shadows stretched across the property. Everything had changed again. Arthur had not abandoned her. He had been trying desperately to protect her, but the truth also hurt in ways Penny did not expect. Arthur had hidden an entire past from her. A woman named Clara, a dangerous land dispute, a secret valuable enough for Grant to threaten and manipulate his own dying father. And now Penny herself stood directly in the middle of it. Fear crept back into her chest. What if Grant came to Red Hollow? What if he already knew she found the deed? Penny looked toward the windows instinctively. The woods beyond the farmhouse suddenly felt less empty. For the first time since arriving, Penny locked the front door before sunset. Then she folded the deed carefully and hid it inside Arthur's coat lining beside the letters. If Grant came searching again, she would not lose the only proof Arthur left behind. Night slowly settled over Red Hollow Farm. But this time, despite the fear and uncertainty, Penny no longer felt entirely powerless. For the first time since Arthur died, she possessed something nobody expected her to have: ownership. And somewhere beneath that realization, another feeling began quietly growing inside her: determination. Grant Ellis discovered Penny was gone 2 days later. The moment he unlocked the Pittsburgh apartment and saw the empty closet, rage spread across his face so quickly that even Caroline stepped backward. She took the coat, he muttered. The living room stood nearly bare now. Penny's suitcase was gone. Arthur's photographs had disappeared from the shelves. The kitchen drawers remained open from her hurried packing. Grant crossed the apartment in long, sharp steps and yanked open Arthur's old desk drawer. Empty. The hidden letter was gone too. Damn it. Caroline closed the front door carefully behind her. Maybe she just went to stay with church friends. Grant turned toward her immediately. No. His voice sounded colder than she expected. She found something. For several seconds, silence filled the apartment. Then, Caroline lowered her purse onto the table slowly. You think Arthur told her about Red Hollow? Grant rubbed both hands across his face angrily. He must have hidden documents somewhere before he died. His jaw tightened. I should have searched this place sooner. Caroline hesitated before speaking again. Maybe we're overreacting. she's 72 years old. What exactly could she do? Grant stared toward the rain-covered windows. A lot. He answered quietly. That frightened Caroline more than shouting would have. She had known Grant for almost 20 years, and during that time she learned one thing clearly: Grant only became truly dangerous when fear entered his voice. And now he was afraid. Grant grabbed his phone and dialed quickly. Find out if Penny Ellis bought a bus ticket leaving Pittsburgh in the last 48 hours, he snapped the moment someone answered. Check Charleston routes, too. He ended the call without goodbye. Caroline crossed her arms. This is getting reckless. Grant laughed bitterly. You know what happens if she reaches that property before us. Caroline did not answer, because she already knew. 6 months earlier, Grant had borrowed heavily against Ellis Development Group after learning about the upcoming highway expansion and mineral survey near Red Hollow. Investors expected him to secure the Bell property before state announcements increased land value. But Arthur refused to sell. At first, Grant assumed his father was simply being stubborn and sentimental about an old abandoned farmhouse. Then he discovered hidden county survey reports locked inside Arthur's desk. Red Hollow Farm was worth millions, and now Penny Ellis legally owned it. Grant slammed his hand against the table suddenly. All that land sitting under a dying old man while I spent years building this company. Caroline watched him carefully. Maybe we should negotiate with her. She won't trust us anymore, then offer more money. Grant shook his head immediately. You still don't understand. He lowered his voice. It's not just the land. Caroline's stomach tightened. Even after years of marriage, Grant rarely discussed Clara Bell openly. Only once, during a drunken argument late at night, had he admitted the Bell property carried old family problems. Now his expression looked darker than she had ever seen. She found Arthur's letters, he muttered. If she finds the testimony too. A knock interrupted him. Grant opened the door to reveal a nervous young employee from his office holding several papers. She took a bus to Red Hollow yesterday morning, the man said carefully. Grant snatched the papers immediately. For one long moment he simply stared at them. Then he grabbed his coat. We're leaving now. Meanwhile, 70 miles away, Penny Ellis sat inside the Red Hollow County Records office, clutching Arthur's deed transfer papers with nervous hands. The building smelled of dust and old paper. Weak sunlight filtered through tall windows while ancient ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. Penny felt painfully out of place there, but she needed proof. If Arthur truly transferred the property legally, she had to know before Grant arrived. An elderly clerk with suspenders and silver hair studied the deed carefully across the counter. His nameplate read, Walter Hayes. Walter adjusted his glasses several times before looking back at Penny. Well, he said slowly, this is real. Penny's breath caught. The transfer was filed 8 months ago. Walter glanced at her kindly. Property belongs to you, Mrs. Ellis. Relief and shock crashed through her simultaneously. For several seconds, she could not speak. Arthur had truly protected her. Not emotionally. Legally. Walter continued flipping through additional records. Then his expression changed slightly. That's interesting. Penny tightened her grip on her purse. Walter looked up carefully. You're not the first Ellis asking questions about this land recently. Fear crept instantly into Penny's chest. Grant Walter nodded slowly. He came through here several times over the past year. Asked about old Bell property maps, mineral surveys, ownership records. Penny lowered her eyes. So Arthur's fears had been justified all along. Walter leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. Most folks around Red Hollow stopped talking about Clara Bell years ago, but some people still remember. Penny hesitated before asking, who was she really? Walter was quiet for several moments. Then he sighed softly. Clara Bell owned a lot more land around here than people realized. Back in the 80s, several wealthy investors started buying farms cheap after coal jobs disappeared. Elderly people got pressured into selling. His expression darkened. Some signatures turned out questionable. Penny felt cold. Illegal Walter nodded carefully. That was the rumor. And Clara, she refused to sell. Walter lowered his voice further. Then she started collecting records. Deeds, payment ledgers, testimony from widows claiming their land had been stolen. Penny's pulse quickened. Arthur's letters suddenly made terrifying sense. What happened to her, Walter looked toward the office windows uneasily. She disappeared before giving official testimony. Silence settled heavily between them. Penny remembered the farmhouse photograph again. Arthur beside Clara. Serious faces. Secrets. "You knew my husband," Penny asked quietly. Walter nodded once. "Arthur came through town years ago. Quiet man. Always looked like he carried something heavy inside him." Guilt, Penny thought immediately. Walter handed back the deed carefully. "If I were you," he said, "I'd keep copies somewhere safe." The warning unsettled her deeply. By late afternoon, dark clouds covered the mountains again when Penny returned to the farmhouse. The moment she stepped onto the porch, something felt wrong. A truck sat parked near the road. Black, polished, expensive enough to look almost unnatural against the old dirt path. Penny froze instantly. Then Grant stepped out from the driver's side. Caroline followed slowly behind him. Fear surged through Penny so suddenly she nearly dropped her purse. Grant smiled, but the expression carried no warmth at all. "There you are," he said. Penny's hands trembled as she unlocked the farmhouse door. "How did you find me?" Grant shrugged lightly. "You're not difficult to track." Caroline glanced around the property with obvious discomfort. "This place is worse than I imagined." Penny said nothing. Grant climbed the porch steps, slowly studying her face carefully. "You found the deed, didn't you?" The question hit like ice water. Penny forced herself not to react. "I don't know what you're talking about." Grant laughed softly. "Penny, please. Dad wasn't clever enough to hide things from me forever." His tone frightened her more than anger would have. Caroline crossed her arms tightly against the cold wind. "Arthur manipulated you. He wasn't thinking clearly near the end." Penny finally looked directly at them. "That's not true." Grant's smile disappeared immediately. "He was sick," he snapped. "Confused, emotional." "No," Penny answered quietly. "He was afraid." For one brief second, Grant's expression changed. Guilt. Then rage covered it again instantly. "You have no idea what's connected to this property. Then tell me." Grant stepped closer. "You don't belong here, Penny." The words carried quiet menace now. "This land should stay with family." Penny tightened Arthur's coat around herself. "I was Arthur's family." Grant's jaw hardened. "You were convenient." The cruelty struck hard, but this time Penny did not lower her eyes. Something inside her had changed since arriving at Red Hollow. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe betrayal had burned away her fear. Or maybe, for the first time in years, she realized silence only protected cruel people. "This farm belongs to me now," she said. Grant stepped even closer until only inches separated them. Then his voice dropped dangerously low. "If you fight this, I can have doctors declare you mentally incompetent within weeks." Penny felt the blood drain from her face. The threat sounded practiced, prepared. Arthur had endured this too. Suddenly, Penny understood everything. Grant had not merely pressured his dying father for money. He had tried to erase him, and now he intended to do the same to her. Grant stared into her frightened eyes for several long seconds before stepping backward again. "Think carefully," he said coldly. "You're alone out here." Then he turned toward the truck. Caroline hesitated briefly before following him, but before climbing inside she looked back once at Penny standing alone on the porch. For the first time, Caroline seemed uncertain, almost guilty. Then the truck disappeared down the muddy road. Silence returned slowly to the farmhouse. Penny remained frozen on the porch long after they left. The mountains around Red Hollow suddenly felt darker than before, because now she understood something terrible. Grant Ellis was not simply chasing money. He was trying to bury the truth before Penny uncovered it. The threat stayed with Penny all night. "If you fight this, I can have doctors declare you mentally incompetent within weeks." Grant's words repeated endlessly in her mind, while wind rattled the farmhouse windows after dark. Penny sat near the fireplace, wrapped in Arthur's coat, unable to relax enough to sleep. She finally understood why Arthur had looked so frightened during his final months. Grant did not simply pressure people. He erased them. Penny stared into the weak fire she had managed to build using old wood from the collapsed porch railing. The farmhouse creaked constantly around her, but tonight, another sound disturbed her even more. Silence. No passing cars. No neighbors. No city noise. If something happened to her here, nobody would know. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Penny considered going directly to the sheriff. But what would she say? That her dead husband left her secret letters about missing testimony and land theft from 40 years ago, that his son threatened to declare her mentally unstable. Without proof, she would sound exactly the way Grant wanted her to sound. Confused, old, paranoid. The realization made her chest tighten painfully. Penny lowered her eyes toward Arthur's final letter spread across the table again. Earlier, she had reread every line, carefully searching for details she missed before. That was when she noticed one sentence near the bottom. "When the house feels empty, listen where the apple tree leans." At first, the words meant nothing. Now, sitting alone inside the cold farmhouse, Penny repeated them softly. "The apple tree." She frowned. There had been several trees behind the property. Could Arthur have hidden something there, too? Morning came gray and bitterly cold. Penny pulled on boots and stepped outside, carrying Arthur's letter in one pocket. Wet grass bent beneath the wind while fog drifted low across the property. Behind the farmhouse stood several dying apple trees twisted with age. Most leaned in different directions, except one. Near the back edge of the property, a large tree tilted sharply toward a collapsed stone foundation hidden beneath weeds. Penny's pulse quickened instantly. Arthur had meant this exact place. She approached slowly. The ground near the foundation looked uneven, as though something had sunk beneath it years earlier. Broken stones covered parts of the area, and thick weeds tangled around rusted metal pieces buried in dirt. Penny knelt carefully despite the pain in her knees. Then she saw it. A metal ring almost completely hidden beneath dead leaves. Her heartbeat quickened. With trembling hands, Penny pulled the weeds aside and exposed what looked like an old cellar door buried beneath mud and roots. Arthur had hidden something underground. Excitement mixed with fear surged through her chest, but the heavy door would not move. Penny pulled harder, but age and rust held it firmly shut. Frustration rose quickly. She was too weak to lift it alone. By afternoon, Penny returned reluctantly to Maggie Harper's diner. The small bell above the diner door rang softly as she entered. Warm air carrying the smell of coffee and soup wrapped around her immediately. Maggie looked up from behind the counter and instantly noticed Penny's exhausted face. "You look worse today," she said gently. Penny sat heavily on a stool. "I think Arthur hid something on the property." Maggie paused mid-motion. "What kind of something I don't know yet?" For several seconds, Penny debated how much truth to reveal. Finally, she lowered her voice. "Grant came yesterday." Maggie's expression darkened immediately. "I figured he might. He threatened me." That seemed to settle something inside Maggie instantly. Without another question, she removed her apron and grabbed her coat from a nearby hook. "Show me the place." Penny blinked in surprise. "Now, you shouldn't be alone out there." The words carried simple kindness, but they nearly brought tears to Penny's eyes. It had been days since anyone treated her like a human being instead of a burden or obstacle. The two women reached the farmhouse near sunset. Maggie followed Penny behind the property until they stood before the leaning apple tree. "Well," Maggie muttered softly, "I'll be damned." Together, they cleared away more weeds and loose stones around the buried cellar entrance. Maggie eventually found an old shovel beside the shed and used it to loosen packed dirt from the edges. Finally, with both women pulling together, the cellar door groaned open. A wave of cold air rose from below. Darkness waited beneath them. Penny felt fear crawl across her skin. Maggie grabbed a flashlight from her truck without hesitation. No point stopping now. Narrow wooden stairs descended into the cellar beneath the farmhouse. Every step creaked dangerously under their weight. Dirt walls surrounded the small underground space, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. Old storage crates lined one side of the room. Most were empty. But near the back wall stood a large metal document box covered in dust. Penny stopped breathing for a moment. Arthur had hidden it carefully. Maggie knelt beside the box and brushed away dirt until a rusted latch became visible. "Locked," she whispered. Penny removed the brass key from her pocket. For several seconds, she simply stared at it in silence. Then slowly, she inserted it into the lock. Click. The sound echoed softly underground. Penny opened the box carefully. Inside lay stacks of old papers wrapped in cloth, faded photographs, property maps, and several sealed envelopes tied together with brittle string. Maggie stared down at the contents in disbelief. Good Lord. Penny lifted the first document carefully. At the top of the page appeared a name: Clara Bell. Her hands trembled violently now. She unfolded the papers slowly while Maggie held the flashlight steady. The documents contained sworn statements, testimonies from elderly landowners, descriptions of forged signatures and pressured sales, lists of properties transferred under suspicious circumstances. Penny's stomach tightened the farther she read. This was not rumor. It was organized theft. Then she found photographs. Men shaking hands beside property signs. County officials standing with developers. And in the background of one faded image, a younger Arthur Ellis. Penny froze. Pain spread sharply through her chest. Arthur knew these people. Not closely, perhaps, but enough to witness what happened. Maggie watched her carefully. You okay? Penny swallowed hard. He was involved somehow. The realization hurt deeply. Arthur had spent years hiding guilt because he failed to stop what happened to Clara Bell and the others. Then Penny found another document near the bottom of the box. A modern business agreement. Her eyes widened immediately. Ellis Development Group. Grant's company name appeared clearly across the page, connected to redevelopment negotiations involving land surrounding Red Hollow. Maggie cursed softly under her breath. He's trying to finish what they started. Penny suddenly understood everything. Grant did not simply want money. He wanted total control over the land before the truth buried beneath it resurfaced publicly. Penny continued searching through the box until she discovered one final envelope addressed in Arthur's handwriting. Inside waited another short note. Penny, if you found Clara's records, then you finally know the worst thing about me. I stayed silent when she needed help most. but the original ledger still exists. It contains names powerful enough to destroy everything Grant built. I hid it where we once asked forgiveness. Arthur Penny reread the final sentence slowly, where we once asked forgiveness. Then realization struck her instantly. The church, she whispered. Maggie frowned. What church? Arthur's church coat, Penny answered. The envelope was hidden inside it. He was pointing me there from the beginning. The abandoned church in Red Hollow. That was where the final truth waited. But suddenly, another sound echoed outside above them. A vehicle. Both women froze instantly. Headlights swept briefly across cracks near the cellar ceiling. Someone had arrived at the farmhouse, and Penny already knew exactly who was hunting for the same secrets underground. The headlights disappeared almost as quickly as they came. Inside the cellar beneath the farmhouse, Penny and Maggie stood frozen in silence, while the sound of an engine faded slowly into the distance. Neither woman moved for several seconds. Finally, Maggie exhaled shakily. Maybe they didn't stop. But Penny was no longer certain of anything. Fear sat heavily in her chest, now colder and sharper than before. Grant knew she had found something important. It was only a matter of time before he returned, searching more aggressively. Maggie looked down at the scattered papers inside the metal box. We can't leave all this here. Penny nodded immediately. Together, they carefully gathered the documents, photographs, and Clara Bell's testimony back into the box. Penny kept Arthur's newest letter folded tightly inside her coat pocket. The church. That was where Arthur had hidden the final ledger. And somehow, Penny already knew that ledger would expose far more than stolen land. The women carried the document box upstairs into the farmhouse living room. Maggie locked the cellar entrance behind them before dragging old boards across it to conceal the door again. Night settled heavily over Red Hollow by the time they finished. Rain tapped softly against broken windows while Penny boiled water for coffee on the old stove. Maggie sat near the fireplace studying Clara Bell's photographs carefully. She was beautiful, Maggie murmured. Penny glanced down at the image in her own hands. Clara Bell stood beside the farmhouse wearing denim overalls and a serious expression. She looked strong, unafraid, the kind of woman who spoke plainly even when people wanted silence. And beside her stood Arthur, younger, nervous, already carrying guilt in his eyes. Jealousy surprised Penny suddenly. Not romantic jealousy, something sadder. Arthur had shared a painful part of his life with another woman, but never trusted Penny enough to tell her about it openly. Maggie must have noticed the expression on her face. You think he loved her. Penny hesitated. I don't know anymore. The honesty of the answer hurt. Maggie leaned back slowly. Sometimes people hide things because they're ashamed, not because they stopped loving somebody. Penny stared quietly into her coffee. That sounded true. Arthur's letters did not feel like the words of a man protecting another woman. They felt like the confession of a man who hated himself for failing one. Still, the secrets had wounded Penny deeply. Around midnight, Maggie finally stood to leave. You sure you'll be okay alone tonight? Penny nodded, though neither woman fully believed it. Before leaving, Maggie pressed a small canister into Penny's hand. Pepper spray, just in case Grant decides to come back acting stupid. For the first time in days, Penny laughed softly. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar. After Maggie left, silence filled the farmhouse again. But tonight the silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Penny locked every door carefully before sitting at the kitchen table beneath the dim lamp. Arthur's coat hung nearby, while Clara Bell's documents spread across the table in careful stacks. Property maps, forged signatures, witness statements. Some pages carried county stamps from decades earlier. Others looked copied secretly from private files. One thing became painfully obvious very quickly. Clara Bell had gathered enough evidence to destroy powerful people, which explained why she disappeared. Penny's eyes drifted toward Arthur's final note again. I hid it where we once asked forgiveness. The church. Arthur had hidden the ledger there because churches were places where people confessed things too painful to carry alone. By sunrise, Penny had made her decision. She would go there immediately before Grant realized the same clue. The abandoned church stood nearly 3 miles outside town along a narrow gravel road. Maggie insisted on driving once Penny called her early the next morning. You're not walking into some abandoned building alone, Maggie said firmly. Fog covered the hills as they drove in through Red Hollow. Old telephone poles leaned beside muddy roads while dead leaves swirled across empty fields. Eventually, the church appeared through the mist. Small, white, decaying. Time had nearly erased it. The wooden cross above the entrance tilted slightly sideways, and several stained glass windows had shattered long ago. Tall weeds surrounded the building like nature itself was swallowing it piece by piece. Penny stared at it silently. Arthur had attended church faithfully every Sunday in Pittsburgh. Now she wondered if guilt had followed him into every prayer. Maggie pushed open the heavy front doors with effort. Dust filled the air immediately. Inside, rows of cracked pews faced a faded altar beneath water-stained ceilings. Weak morning light spilled through broken windows, illuminating floating dust particles like drifting ash. The church felt abandoned, but not empty. Penny walked slowly down the center aisle, holding Arthur's letter tightly. Where we once asked forgiveness, she whispered again. Maggie glanced around carefully. Could mean anywhere in here. Penny's eyes moved upward toward the old choir loft above them. Then, suddenly, she remembered something. Arthur always loved choir music. Even in Pittsburgh, he chose the same pew every Sunday just to hear the choir better. Without fully knowing why, Penny climbed the narrow staircase toward the loft. Each step creaked beneath her weight. At the top waited broken chairs, old hymn books, and dust-covered shelves. Wind moved softly through shattered stained glass nearby. Penny looked around slowly. Then she noticed one hymn board hanging unevenly against the wall. Her heartbeat quickened. Carefully, she pulled it forward. Behind it rested a leather-bound ledger wrapped inside cloth. Penny stopped breathing. Arthur hid it here. Maggie climbed the stairs behind her and stared in disbelief. My God! Penny's trembling fingers slowly opened the ledger. Inside waited page after page of handwritten entries. Illegal payments, land transfers, property acquisitions linked to intimidation and forged signatures. Names appeared repeatedly beside amounts of money and parcel numbers. Developers, county officials, business owners, and then Penny saw the Ellis name. Not Grant. Arthur. Only once, beside a short handwritten note. Witness present during disputed transfer. Penny closed her eyes painfully. Arthur had not been one of the men stealing land, but he witnessed it and stayed silent. The shame he carried for decades suddenly became horribly clear. Maggie touched Penny's shoulder gently. He tried to fix it in the end. Before Penny could answer, a sharp voice echoed through the church below. Step away from that ledger. Both women froze instantly. Grant stood at the bottom of the staircase with 2 large men beside him. Penny's blood turned cold. Grant climbed the stairs slowly, his face tight with fury. You really have no idea what you're interfering with, he said. Maggie stepped protectively beside Penny. Back off. Grant ignored her completely. His eyes remained fixed on the ledger in Penny's hands. That belongs to my family. No, Penny answered quietly. It belongs to the truth. Grant's jaw tightened violently. You think those papers make you some kind of hero? Penny said nothing. Grant moved closer. You don't understand how this world works. Clara Bell lost because people like her always lose. The cruelty in his voice shocked even Maggie. Quietly, without Grant noticing, Maggie slipped her phone from her pocket and pressed record. Grant continued speaking. My father wasted his entire life drowning in guilt over land that was going to be developed eventually anyway. Penny stared at him in disbelief. You threatened your own father. Grant laughed bitterly. He was weak. The words echoed painfully through the empty church. For one brief second, Penny saw something frightening inside Grant Ellis. Not greed alone, contempt for weakness, for compassion, for anyone who slowed his ambition. Penny tightened her grip on the ledger. You drained his accounts. He gave me authority. You terrified him. Grant stepped closer until only inches separated them. He should have signed the property over years ago. One of the men behind him moved forward slightly. Maggie immediately raised her phone higher. I'm recording everything. Grant finally noticed the phone. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Penny saw it instantly. Fear. Not of her, of exposure. Walter Hayes suddenly appeared at the church entrance below. I already called the sheriff, he shouted upward. Grant cursed under his breath immediately. The tension shifted. One of the men stepped backward toward the door. Maggie lowered her voice coldly. Go ahead. Explain to police why you're threatening a 72-year-old widow inside a church. Grant stared at Penny with open hatred now. Then slowly he stepped backward. This isn't over, he said quietly. Penny did not lower her eyes this time. No, she answered. It's finally beginning. Grant turned sharply and disappeared down the staircase with the others. Silence returned slowly to the church. Penny looked down at the ledger, trembling in her hands. For the first time since Arthur died, she understood something clearly. Grant Ellis was no longer hiding, and now she finally possessed enough truth to destroy everything he built from lies. 3 days later, Grant Ellis filed legal papers against Penny. The sheriff delivered them personally to the farmhouse just after noon. Penny stood silently on the porch while the older deputy removed his hat awkwardly and handed her the envelope. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ellis, he said quietly. Court hearings scheduled for next Thursday. Penny's hands trembled before she even opened the documents. By the time she finished reading, her knees felt weak. Petition for emergency guardianship evaluation. Grant was officially requesting the court declare Penny mentally incompetent, exactly as he promised. Maggie cursed loudly the moment she read the paperwork. He's trying to scare you into surrendering the property, but Penny barely heard her. One sentence repeated endlessly in her mind. Respondent displays paranoid delusions involving hidden conspiracies, financial confusion, and irrational attachment to abandoned property. Paranoid delusions. The words hurt more than insults. Grant was not simply trying to steal the land anymore. He was trying to erase Penny herself. That night, she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the court papers, while rain battered the farmhouse roof. At 72 years old, she suddenly felt ancient, fragile, tired. Maybe Grant would win after all. He had money, lawyers, business connections. Penny had only old letters, hidden ledgers, and the word of people from a forgotten town. Fear settled heavily inside her chest. What if the judge believed Grant? What if doctors decided she truly was confused? Old women disappeared quietly into assisted living facilities every day. Penny had seen it happen before. Once independence vanished, people stopped listening to you entirely. The thought terrified her. Arthur must have felt the same fear before he died. That realization broke something inside her. Penny lowered her head and cried silently at the kitchen table. Not because of the court papers, because she finally understood how alone Arthur must have felt while his own son slowly took control of his life. A knock sounded at the door shortly after sunset. Penny wiped her face quickly before opening it. Walter Hayes stood outside carrying a cardboard box beneath one arm. "I figured you might need company," he said gently. Inside the box were old county records and copies of historical property maps. Maggie followed behind him, carrying coffee and sandwiches from the diner. Neither mentioned Penny's tears. For the next hour, the three sat around the kitchen table, reviewing documents beneath the weak overhead light. Walter pointed toward several names listed repeatedly beside disputed property transfers. These families controlled most development around Red Hollow back then, he explained. The same names still owned businesses around here today. Penny noticed one detail immediately. Several modern development agreements connected directly to Ellis Development Group. Grant's company was tied to the same network Clara Bell tried exposing decades earlier. Maggie leaned back heavily in her chair. "Your husband tried to stop it in the end." Penny looked down quietly. "I wish he trusted me sooner." Walter nodded sadly. Men from Arthur's generation carried shame like chains. Some never learned how to ask for help. The words lingered painfully. Arthur had spent years drowning in guilt and fear while pretending everything was normal. And Penny never saw it clearly enough. A sudden engine sound outside interrupted the conversation. All three froze instantly. Headlights swept briefly across the farmhouse windows before stopping near the porch. Penny's heart jumped. But instead of Grant, a woman stepped out carrying a leather briefcase and umbrella. She looked younger than Penny expected, perhaps early 40s, with sharp dark eyes and a charcoal coat damp from rain. Walter immediately stood. Rachel. The woman entered the farmhouse and shook rainwater from her umbrella. "Rachel Kim," she said, extending her hand toward Penny. "Walter called me." Penny shook her hand cautiously. "She's one of the best attorneys in Charleston," Walter explained, "especially with elder exploitation cases." Rachel removed several folders from her briefcase and sat at the kitchen table without wasting time. "Walter gave me a summary on the drive here," she said calmly. "I'd like to see everything." For nearly 2 hours, Penny and the others explained the entire story. Arthur's hidden letters, the deed transfer, Clara Bell's testimony, the church ledger, Grant's threats. Rachel listened carefully without interrupting. When Penny finally finished, silence filled the room briefly. Then Rachel leaned back slowly. "This is far bigger than a guardianship petition." Penny stared at her uncertainly. Rachel tapped the court papers sharply. "Grant filed these documents because he's scared." The statement surprised Penny. Scared of what? Rachel opened one of the ledger copies. Fraud. Elder coercion. Potential criminal conspiracy connected to property theft. She looked directly at Penny, and most importantly, exposure. Maggie smiled grimly. "That's what I've been saying." Rachel continued flipping through papers. "Your husband's letters help establish motive and fear. The ledger establishes historical misconduct. But what matters most is proving Grant manipulated Arthur before his death." Penny lowered her eyes sadly. "I don't know if I can prove that." Rachel looked up immediately. "Actually, I think you can." She reached into another folder. Walter frowned. "What's that A notarized statement filed privately 8 months ago?" Penny's heartbeat quickened instantly. Rachel slid the document across the table. Arthur Ellis's signature appeared clearly at the bottom. Penny covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "I discovered it through a courthouse archive request this afternoon," Rachel explained. "Arthur submitted this through an independent legal service shortly after transferring the property." Penny unfolded the statement slowly. "As I write this document, I fear my son Grant Ellis is attempting to pressure and manipulate me regarding ownership of Red Hollow Farm and related financial accounts." Tears blurred Penny's vision immediately. Arthur knew. He knew Grant would eventually come after her too. Rachel continued quietly. This statement directly contradicts Grant's claim that Arthur was mentally confused when signing the deed. Walter shook his head slowly in disbelief. Arthur tried to protect her all along. Penny pressed the paper carefully against her chest. For the first time since Arthur died, some of her anger toward him softened. He had failed Clara Bell once, but he refused to fail Penny the same way. Rachel leaned forward seriously. "You need to understand something clearly, Penny." Penny looked up. "You are not the weak side in this anymore." The words struck her deeply, because for weeks now, everyone, including herself, had treated her like a frightened widow barely surviving disaster. But Rachel saw something different. Evidence. Truth. Strength. Maggie smiled softly. "Told you." Rachel organized the documents into careful stacks. "Grant's lawyers will try portraying you as emotional, unstable, and manipulated by locals." She paused. "You cannot lose control in court." Fear returned briefly to Penny's chest. "I've never testified in court before." "You don't need performance," Rachel answered calmly. "You only need truth." Late that night, after Rachel finally left for Charleston, Penny stood alone on the farmhouse porch beneath cold mountain stars. Wind moved softly through the old apple trees nearby. For several minutes, she simply listened to the silence around Red Hollow. Then slowly, she realized something important. She was no longer hiding. Not from Grant. Not from Arthur's past. Not even from herself. The frightened woman who arrived at this farmhouse carrying one suitcase had begun changing into someone stronger. Not fearless, but unwilling to disappear quietly. Inside the house, Arthur's old coat still hung beside the doorway. Penny touched the sleeve gently. "You should have trusted me," she whispered softly into the night. Then she looked toward the dark road leading out of Red Hollow. Next week, Grant Ellis would try humiliating her publicly. He would try convincing the court she was weak, confused, and incapable. But this time, Penny would not sit silently while someone stole her life. And for the first time in many years, the thought of fighting back no longer terrified her. It steadied her. The courthouse in Red Hollow was smaller than Penny expected. The old brick building stood near the center of town beside a war memorial and a row of nearly empty storefronts. Rain clouds hung low above the mountains that morning, covering everything in dull gray light. Penny sat quietly in the passenger seat of Maggie's truck, staring at the courthouse steps. Her stomach twisted painfully. "You don't have to be fearless," Maggie said gently beside her. "You just have to walk inside." Penny nodded slowly. She wore Arthur's old church coat over a dark blue dress. Rachel Kim had advised her to look calm, simple, and dignified, but no amount of careful clothing could stop her hands from trembling. People already filled the courthouse hallway when they entered. Local reporters stood near the entrance whispering quietly. Apparently, word had spread quickly about the land dispute involving Ellis Development Group. Penny immediately noticed strangers looking at her with curiosity. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked doubtful. Grant stood near the courtroom doors beside his attorney, a tall, silver-haired man with expensive glasses and a perfectly controlled expression. Caroline sat nearby wearing a pale cream coat, her face tense and unreadable. The moment Grant saw Penny, his jaw tightened. But Penny noticed something else, too. He looked tired. For the first time since Arthur's death, Grant Ellis no longer appeared fully confident. Rachel arrived moments later carrying several thick folders beneath one arm. "You ready?" she asked quietly. "No," Penny admitted. Rachel smiled faintly. "Good. Nervous people tell the truth." The courtroom itself felt smaller than Penny imagined. Dark wood, faded flags, old ceiling fans turning slowly overhead. Penny sat beside Rachel while Grant positioned himself across the aisle. He never looked directly at her once proceedings began. The judge entered promptly at 10 o'clock. After brief introductions, Grant's attorney stood first. His voice sounded polished and calm. Your Honor, this case concerns the safety and well-being of an elderly widow experiencing severe emotional distress following the death of her husband. Penny felt humiliation burned inside her chest immediately. The attorney continued. Mrs. Ellis recently abandoned her home, isolated herself in a deteriorating rural property, and developed increasingly paranoid beliefs involving conspiracies, hidden documents, and criminal accusations. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Penny lowered her eyes briefly. Hearing her life described that way made even she sound unstable. Grant's attorney glanced toward her sympathetically. My client, Grant Ellis, has only sought to ensure proper care and protection for his late father's widow. Protection. The word nearly made Penny sick. Rachel remained calm beside her, quietly taking notes. Grant's attorney continued speaking for nearly 20 minutes. He described Penny as vulnerable, grieving, emotionally manipulated by outsiders, and incapable of responsibly managing valuable property. By the time he finished, Penny felt physically exhausted. Then Rachel stood. Everything about her voice felt different. Clear, precise, controlled. Your Honor, she began, this is not a guardianship case. She placed several documents before the judge. This is an attempt to silence a woman who discovered evidence of financial coercion, fraudulent property activity, and elder exploitation. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Rachel presented the deed transfer first. The property known as Red Hollow Farm was legally transferred to Mrs. Penny Ellis 8 months before Arthur Ellis died. Grant's attorney immediately objected. Rachel remained calm. We also possess a notarized statement written personally by Arthur Ellis expressing fear that his son was pressuring him regarding property and financial control. That changed the atmosphere instantly. Grant finally looked toward Penny. For the first time, real fear appeared behind his eyes. Rachel handed copies of Arthur's statement to the judge. Penny watched silently as the older man adjusted his glasses and began reading. Meanwhile, Rachel continued carefully building the story piece by piece. Bank transfers, power of attorney irregularities, the hidden letters, Clara Bell's testimony, the church ledger. Grant's attorney objected repeatedly, but Rachel anticipated nearly every argument before it came. Then Walter Hayes took the witness stand. The elderly county clerk testified calmly about Grant's repeated visits requesting Red Hollow property records before Arthur's death. He appeared very interested in obtaining the Bell property quickly, Walter explained. Grant stared downward throughout the testimony. Next came Maggie Harper. Unlike Walter, Maggie looked openly angry while speaking. Rachel asked only one question before Maggie reached into her purse. Did you ever witness Mr. Ellis threatening Mrs. Ellis? Yes. She placed her phone onto the evidence table. I recorded part of it. A murmur spread quietly through the courtroom. Grant's face lost color immediately. The recording played clearly enough for everyone to hear. You think those papers make you some kind of hero? He was weak. He should have signed the property over years ago. Silence followed the recording. Even the judge looked disturbed. Grant's attorney stood quickly. This recording lacks context. But Rachel interrupted immediately. The context is intimidation. Then she turned toward Grant directly. Mr. Ellis, did you or did you not threaten to have Mrs. Ellis declared mentally incompetent. Grant hesitated too long, and everyone noticed. Finally, he answered tightly. I was concerned about her behavior. Rachel stepped closer. Behavior like discovering documents your father hid from you. Grant's composure cracked slightly. My father was manipulated. By whom? Grant glanced briefly toward Penny. That woman filled his head with nonsense for years. The cruelty of the statement stunned the courtroom. Penny felt pain stab through her chest, but she kept her posture straight. Rachel's voice sharpened immediately. "So, your dying father was either manipulated or mentally confused whenever he disagreed with you." Grant said nothing. Rachel pressed harder. "You controlled his finances. He gave me authority. You drained joint accounts. I handled business obligations. You attempted to pressure him into surrendering Red Hollow Farm." Grant finally snapped. Because he was wasting everything over dead people and ancient lies, the outburst echoed through the courtroom. Complete silence followed. Rachel slowly stepped backward. No further questions. Grant realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late. The judge watched him with obvious concern now. Then Rachel introduced her final witness, a retired hospice nurse named Denise Holloway. The elderly woman walked slowly to the stand and adjusted her glasses carefully before speaking. "I cared for Arthur Ellis during his final weeks," she said quietly. Rachel nodded. "In your professional opinion, was Arthur Ellis mentally competent when he signed his notarized statement?" "Yes." "Did he ever express fear regarding his son?" Denise hesitated briefly. Then she answered softly. "Repeatedly." Grant closed his eyes. Denise continued. "He asked several times whether private conversations with attorneys could remain confidential. He seemed terrified his son would discover certain documents." Rachel let silence settle heavily before asking one final question. "Did Arthur Ellis appear confused?" "No." Denise answered firmly. "He appeared trapped." The word landed harder than anything else said that day. Trapped. Penny suddenly felt tears filling her eyes again. Because it was true. Arthur spent his final months trapped between guilt fear and a son he no longer recognized. After closing arguments, the judge recessed briefly before returning with his decision. The courtroom stood silently as he adjusted papers before him. "This court finds insufficient evidence supporting claims of mental incompetence against Mrs. Penny Ellis." Relief hit Penny so suddenly she nearly lost breath. The judge continued. "Additionally, evidence presented today raises significant concerns regarding possible financial coercion, abuse of power of attorney authority, and property-related misconduct." Grant stared downward, motionless. "The petition for guardianship is dismissed immediately." A soft murmur spread through the courtroom, but the judge was not finished. "The ownership of Red Hollow Farm remains legally vested in Mrs. Penny Ellis." Penny closed her eyes briefly. Arthur protected her after all. The judge's final words struck hardest. "This court further recommends that relevant financial and property evidence be reviewed by state investigators." Grant's face turned pale. Everything he built was beginning to collapse publicly. Court adjourned moments later. People slowly exited while reporters rushed toward the hallway outside. Grant remained seated several seconds longer before finally standing. For one brief moment, his eyes met Penny's across the courtroom. There was no apology there, only bitterness. Then he walked away beside his attorney without another word. Penny remained seated quietly long after the room emptied. Rachel touched her shoulder gently. "You won." But Penny did not feel victorious. She felt tired, sad, relieved, and somewhere beneath everything else free. As she finally stood to leave, Penny rested one hand softly against Arthur's old coat. "You should have trusted me sooner," she whispered silently in her heart. Then she walked out of the courtroom, no longer looking like a frightened widow driven from her home. She walked out looking like a woman who survived. Autumn arrived slowly in Red Hollow. By October, the mountains surrounding the farmhouse burned with shades of gold amber and deep red. Cold wind carried leaves across the porch while morning fog settled gently over the fields behind the property. The farmhouse no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive again. The broken porch railing had been repaired. Maggie helped Penny repaint the kitchen during long afternoons filled with coffee and quiet conversation. Walter Hayes spent weekends fixing loose floorboards while complaining about his knees the entire time. Even the old apple tree behind the house seemed stronger somehow. Penny often stood beneath its branches at sunset thinking about how close she came to losing everything, not only the property, herself. 3 months had passed since the courthouse hearing. State investigators officially opened fraud inquiries connected to Ellis Development Group, and several historical property transfers linked to names inside Clara Bell's ledger. Newspapers across Charleston and Pittsburgh published articles questioning decades of land acquisitions throughout the region. Grant Ellis disappeared from public view almost immediately afterward. Several investors withdrew from his development projects. Bank accounts connected to ongoing investigations became temporarily frozen. Rumors spread quickly through Red Hollow that Caroline moved into a separate apartment in Charleston after the scandal exploded publicly. Penny heard the gossip but rarely commented. Hatred exhausted her now. Some evenings, she still thought about Grant sitting alone somewhere carrying the same bitterness that destroyed Arthur's final years. She could not forgive what he had done, but she also refused to spend the rest of her life poisoned by him. One chilly afternoon, Rachel Kim arrived at the farmhouse carrying legal folders and a cardboard box. "Well," she announced while stepping inside, "you officially own one of the most argued-over farms in West Virginia." Penny laughed softly from the kitchen table. The sound still surprised her sometimes. Rachel placed several signed documents in front of Penny. Final confirmations, protected land status paperwork, development restrictions. "Nobody touches this property without your approval now." Penny stared down at the papers quietly. For most of her life, important decisions belonged to other people. School administrators, landlords, Arthur, Grant. Now, for the first time at 72 years old, something belonged entirely to her. Rachel nodded toward the cardboard box. "There's one more thing." Inside the box rested the remaining contents recovered from the cellar beneath the apple tree. Most had already been cataloged for investigators. But one sealed envelope remained untouched, Arthur's final letter. Penny recognized his handwriting immediately. Her chest tightened. She had delayed opening it for weeks, partly from fear, partly because some wounds heal slowly, even after truth arrives. Rachel squeezed her shoulder gently before leaving Penny alone in the kitchen. Outside, evening sunlight filtered through the windows in warm, golden streaks. The farmhouse felt peaceful now, safe. Penny carried the envelope slowly onto the front porch. Arthur's old church coat rested folded neatly across the rocking chair beside her. For several long moments, she simply looked out across the property. The same land Grant tried stealing. The same land Clara Bell died protecting. The same land Arthur spent years hiding out of shame. Then Penny finally opened the letter. "My Penny, if you are reading this, then you survived the storm I spent years fearing would destroy you. First, I need you to know something clearly before anything else. I loved you, not out of loneliness, not because I needed someone to care for me. I loved you because you brought peace into a life that had forgotten how to deserve it." Tears filled Penny's eyes immediately. Arthur's voice felt alive inside every word. She continued reading slowly. "When I told you there was nothing left to leave you, I lied because I believed fear would protect you better than truth. Grant watched everything near the end. My money, my records, my phone calls. I knew if he discovered the farm belonged to you, he would come after you exactly the way he came after me." Penny lowered the page briefly, breathing shakily. Arthur had known all along. Every fear, every threat, every possibility. The letter continued. "Years ago, I failed Clara Bell when she needed courage from me. I witnessed terrible things and convinced myself silence was safer than fighting powerful men. By the time I understood what that silence cost, Clara was gone. I carried that shame for the rest of my life. But I could not die allowing the same greed to destroy you, too. Penny pressed trembling fingers against her lips. For so long, she misunderstood Arthur's silence as weakness. Now, she understood it differently. He had been a frightened man trying desperately to become brave before time ran out. Arthur's handwriting grew shakier near the bottom of the final page. The farmhouse was never the real inheritance. Neither was the land. What I truly wanted to leave you was freedom. A place nobody could push you out of, a truth nobody could steal, and the chance to become stronger than I ever was. Please forgive me for trusting fear too long. Love, always, Arthur. Penny closed her eyes as tears rolled quietly down her face. Not the violent grief from the funeral, not the humiliation from Pittsburgh. Something softer. Release. For a long time she sat silently on the porch, holding Arthur's letter against her chest, while evening light faded slowly across Red Hollow Farm. Eventually, Maggie arrived, carrying soup containers from the diner. The older woman stopped immediately when she saw Penny crying. "You all right?" Penny smiled through tears. Yes, and for the first time since Arthur died, she truly meant it. Weeks later, construction began on a small community office near the edge of the property. Penny named it the Clara Bell Trust. Using settlement funds and income from protected mineral rights agreements, she created a legal support program helping elderly homeowners facing coercion, fraudulent land deals, and property theft. Rachel volunteered legal services twice each month. Walter organized records. Maggie handled nearly everything else while loudly pretending she was absolutely not retired enough for this nonsense. People slowly began arriving from neighboring counties seeking help. Widows, retired farmers, elderly couples pressured by developers. Penny listened to every story carefully because she understood humiliation now in ways she never had before. And each time she helped someone protect their home, a small part of Arthur's guilt seemed to loosen from the land itself. One evening, near the end of October, Penny stood alone beneath the old apple tree behind the farmhouse. The restored porch glowed warmly in the distance beneath soft yellow lights. Arthur's coat remained folded across the rocking chair exactly where she left it. Above her, autumn leaves moved gently in the cold evening wind. Penny looked toward the cellar hidden beneath the earth, toward the church beyond the hills, toward the road leading back to Pittsburgh and the frightened woman she used to be. Grant Ellis tried taking everything from her, her home, her dignity, her voice. Instead, he unknowingly pushed her toward the one place where she finally discovered her own strength. Penny touched the folded letter inside her coat pocket and smiled softly into the fading sunset. For most of her life, she believed survival meant enduring quietly. Now, she understood something different. Sometimes survival meant finally refusing to disappear, and sometimes the life people tried to steal from you became the doorway to the life you were always meant to find.